In this video, we'll be talking about Robert Nozick and his theory of distributive justice. Nozick was at Harvard from 1969 for the rest of his career. So he was there at the same time as John Rawls, a philosopher with whom he's often contrasted because they have very different theories of distributive justice. Rawls came out with his big book, A Theory of Justice, in 1971. Nozick came out with his on roughly the same topic, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, 3 years later in 1974. And that's the book from which our reading is drawn. Now, Nozick's theory of distributive justice, he describes as a theory of entitlement, and it involves justice in holdings. Now, by holdings, he basically means possessions. So the question here is, what do we justly possess? What do you have a right to possess? Another way to say that is, what is your property? So in order to determine justice in holdings, or who has a right to which possessions, we're going to need to know a number of principles. The first principle is the principle of justice in acquisition. And this will be a principle which tells us how unheld things may come to be held. That is, how things which are no one's property yet may become someone's property. Secondly, you're going to need a principle of justice in transfer. And that's going to be a principle that tells you how things that are held by one person may come to be held by another person. That is, how something which is my property can justly become your property. And then finally, you're also going to need a principle of justice and rectification. And that principle will tell you how to fix, how to correct, how to rectify injustice in holdings. So it will tell us what to do if I happen to possess something which is not really my property, to which I have no just right. What happens next? Now, Nozick doesn't spell out what these principles are. He doesn't tell us how we may come to make unheld things our own. He doesn't tell us what the principle of justice and transfer is. He doesn't tell us what the principle of justice and rectification is. He just says there've got to be such principles. Okay, so it's sort of an empty schematism that tells us here's the general shape of justice and holdings, and leaves it to us to fill in the details. However, that general schematism allows him to generate a theory of entitlement. That is, a theory that tells us who is entitled to possess what holdings. So the first principle in his theory of entitlement is this: a person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice in acquisition is entitled to that holding. 2, a person who acquires a holding in accordance with the principle of justice in transfer from someone else who is entitled to the holding is entitled to the holding. And thirdly, no one is entitled to a holding except by repeated applications of 1 and 2. So that first point there says that if we discover an island that nobody possesses, that's no one's property, and it's got coconuts on it, and if I follow the principle of justice and acquisitions, whatever that happens to be, and thereby make the coconuts my own, well, then I'm entitled to the coconuts if I played by the rules in getting those coconuts. Similarly, if I transfer the coconuts to you in accordance with the principle of justice and transfer, and if I was entitled to them in the first place, then you are entitled to the coconuts now. So whatever that rule is, whatever the principle of justice and transfer amounts to, if we follow it and I was entitled to them first, then you're entitled to the coconuts now. And basically, that's the whole theory. If you get your stuff by playing by those rules from other people who have played by those rules, whatever the rules are, then you are entitled to your stuff. That's all there is to it. Distributive justice amounts to this: a distribution of goods and benefits and so forth is just if everyone is entitled to the holdings that they possess under that distribution. The big idea is this, that justice in holdings is historical. It depends upon what actually has happened. Did we play by the rules in getting this stuff or not? If we did, then that's justice. What matters isn't how the holdings are distributed in the end. So it doesn't matter whether at the end of the day, I have a bunch more coconuts than you do, or vice versa. It doesn't matter even if I'm starving to death because I have no coconuts and you have too many. What matters isn't how much we end up with, but how we got the coconuts in the first place. How did you get your stuff? It's all based on what happened in the past. Now, Nozick thinks that anytime you grant people liberty, it's going to mess up any pattern which you think ought to be the case when it comes to the distribution of goods. So think, for example, of Rawls. Here's a point of contrast. Rawls thinks that a distribution of goods is just if it results from rules that give the least well-off people in society the best possible situation that they could have, better than under any other distribution of goods. Some other people think that an even simpler version of this would be, look, a distribution of goods is just if everybody's got total equality of goods. And that may be an unpopular theory, but it's a simple one. The idea is outcomes are what's just or unjust. But Nozick says if what you want is any specific kind of outcome where we all have the best possible situation, or we're all equal, or whatever you want, or we all have what we need, if what you want is a certain kind of outcome, that's going to be incompatible with individual liberty. And in order to illustrate this point, he gives us the Wilt Chamberlain example. Now, Wilt Chamberlain was a great basketball player in the 1970s, which is when Nozick was writing. So let's imagine that the world is set up according to D1. And by D1, I mean your favorite non-entitlement distribution of goods, the way you think goods ought to be in an ideal world. And for simplicity's sake, let's just say it's total equality. You think the way things ought to be ideally is total equality of goods. Okay, let's say the world is set up that way. Then the idea is that Wilt Chamberlain makes a whole bunch of money playing basketball because we all wanted to go see him play. At the end of that season, the perfect distribution is now all messed up because Chamberlain's made a lot of money. He's got a lot more money than the rest of us. And Nozick says, but there can't be anything unjust about that because we started out from a position of justice. All the transfers that happened during the season were just. Nobody was held up at gunpoint and made to hand over their goods. It was all, consensual exchanges of money and tickets. So the second distribution of goods at the end of the season, the way things were at the end, can't be unjust. You can't go from justice through just processes and get to injustice at the end. That doesn't make any sense. Let me give you some charts that make this simpler. So here we are at the beginning of the season. We have a society of 4 people, Chamberlain, Marvin, Martha, and Donnie, and they've all got the same amount of money before the season. Then Wilt Chamberlain makes a deal with the NBA and says, I would like to get 1/4 of all the ticket sales that are when people come to see me play this season. And the NBA owners agree, and everybody comes and they put a quarter in at the turnstile in the Wilt Chamberlain box because they want to see him play. Marvin and Martha and Donnie, they all do that. Well, at the end of the season, Chamberlain's got a bunch more money than them. So Nozick's whole point is, yeah, that's no longer equal, but it can't be unjust because that was all voluntary. Now, if you want things to go back to total equality or whatever ideal scheme you have in mind, you're going to have to redistribute Will to wealth at the end of the season. You're going to have to take away all the extra money that he made, all the profits, and give them back to Marvin and Martha and Donnie. That's what that light green symbolizes. The moral of the story here is that liberty is going to upset any supposedly ideal distribution of income. No end state principle or distributional pattern principle of justice can be continuously realized without continuous interference with people's lives. And for Nozick, that's unacceptable because liberty is a really high ideal. Liberty is way more important than, say, equality or any kind of particular pattern of the way you want society set up. Freedom is paramount, which is why he's a hero of libertarians. Now, a couple things to think about with Nozick's theory. It may be appealing, but again, we don't know whether our society is really just, whether distributions are really just in our real world, even according to Nozick's theory, unless we know two things. First of all, we got to know what the correct principles of justice in acquisition, transfer, and rectification really are. Again, Nozick didn't tell us what those principles are. He just said there must be such principles. But unless we know what those principles are, we don't know who's played by the rules and who hasn't. And then also, not only do we have to know what the correct principles are, we have to know what's actually happened in the whole history of holdings. We have to know whether people have played by the rules in getting what they've got, and whether they got what they got from other people who had played by the rules. Unless we know that, we don't know whether anybody's actually entitled to anything that they have right now. The principle of rectification, which again, Nozick doesn't tell us what that amounts to, is particularly important and vexing. He says, a distribution is just if it arises from another just distribution by legitimate means. But again, in the real world, our present distribution has arisen in part from historical injustices. A lot of the distribution of wealth that we see is a result of somebody sometime, somewhere back down the line, maybe not even anyone living, but people cheating each other, stealing from each other, enslaving each other. Okay, so we need a principle of rectification that tells us, how do we make that right? That is, how do we make things the way they would have been without that injustice? What is that principle? Nozick doesn't tell it to us. What do you think it should be? So again, this raises difficult questions. Is it even possible to know how things would have been in the world if some specific injustice had not occurred? How much wealth would you have right now if there had never been slavery in North America? I have no idea. Is it possible to redistribute wealth to make things the way that they would have been? Should we even try to do that? Or is that a fool's errand? What should we do to rectify past injustices? And if we can't even begin to rectify past injustices or even figure out what injustices have occurred, should we just give up on an entitlement theory of holdings, which looks back to the past to determine justice? Should we instead adopt some end state distributional principle, which tells us how things should be in the future or in the present? Think about it.